In chapter 22, we're going to be looking at the digestive system, which is also known as the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract, or also as the alimentary canal. And from the diagram here, you can see some of the major parts that we'll be looking at, beginning with the mouth and the oral cavity there, moving down through the esophagus, going into the stomach. We'll be talking about some of the accessory organs such as the liver, the gallbladder, even the pancreas. Even though we've seen this before in the endocrine chapter, we'll revisit this again because it does have exocrine functions. The stomach, and then the intestines, the small intestines and large intestines. But before we begin that, let's kind of look at some of the major functions. There's many different functions. Your textbook kind of outlines these pretty much in order as you see these. For example, number one is ingestion. Part of the function of the digestive system is to get the food, introduce the food into the stomach. And of course, that begins with the mouth. Propulsion or movement. There's a couple of vocabulary words. Make sure you make a note of these vocab words. Deglutition. This is the act of swallowing, and that's a type of propulsion or movement through the beginning with the mouth and swallowing food. That's deglutition. And then the general type of movement through the GI tract is called peristalsis. That's where you're moving food or partially broken down food through the GI tract. It actually begins after you swallow. So after deglutition, you'll start the process of peristalsis, and it's a repeated type of smooth muscle action where the smooth muscle, for example, lining the esophagus and lining the intestines, they contract and relax, and that tries to squeeze and push food down through the GI tract. Then function number three, we'll be talking about different secretions throughout the GI system. And these secretions do many different things, such as they help to lubricate the GI tract. They help to liquefy the food, which is to basically just add water to it, making it easier to digest and easier to move through the GI tract. Some liquids provide some buffering ability. That means that they help to balance the pH. And then some secretions are enzyme-based and acid-based, and they help to digest the food that we're eating. And so you can see on the slide several different types of secretions. For example, mucus, that is a secretion found in the GI tract. That mucus is there. We usually think about mucus in the respiratory tract, but we find it here again in the digestive tract because you need something to help lubricate the food as it's moving through, lubricate the esophagus and the stomach. It also helps protect your stomach, especially from digestion. That's because your stomach, and we'll talk about this a little later, is producing acid in the form of hydrochloric acid, and it has some very digestive enzymes, protein enzymes, and you need to protect your actual stomach organ from the digestion, from its own digestion, and that would cause some kind of ulcer maybe you've heard about. And then water, that's important because that helps to liquefy the word there is liquefaction. It helps to liquefy the food, making it a little easier to digest and then eventually be reabsorbed or absorbed absorbed by the intestines into the bloodstream. Bile is another secretion. Now we'll talk about this a little later, but this is a secretion of the liver. It's produced by the liver and it's stored in the gallbladder. One of its main functions, this is not the only function, but one of its main functions is to help in the breakdown of fats, and that's a process called emulsification. So it helps to emulsify fats. It just means that it breaks the fats into smaller droplets or particles. And then we'll talk about various enzymes along the way, and that helps in the chemical digestion of food. Then the last three functions here, function four, digestion, of course, that is both mechanical and chemical. Mechanical means you're physically breaking up food. So for example, when you chew your food, you're just tearing it into smaller and smaller pieces. That's mechanically digesting it. But then when you add enzymes or chemicals or acid to a food to try to break it down chemically, then that's a chemical type of digestion. You're actually changing the chemical nature of the food. Then function number five is absorption. Once you've completed the digestion process, you move the digested nutrients now have to be transferred from your GI tract into your blood circulation, and that's a process of absorption that takes place in the intestines. And then function number 6 is defecation. There's always going to be some type of waste product that's produced or something that cannot be digested and absorbed. And so those waste products have to be removed from the body. That's the process of defecation. Now, to understand the digestive tract, we need to look at a little bit of tissues, histology here, of the GI tract. There are 4 main layers, and sometimes you see these referred to as tunics. That word tunic just means layer. And so 4 main tunics or layers. We'll start with the innermost layer. The inner lining is a mucosa layer. As you can see, the name implies that this is where the mucus is going to be secreted. This is the inner lining of the GI tract. It's basically epithelial tissue. There is some connective tissue associated with it. That's called loose connective tissue. And there's also a little bit of a smooth muscle there. This is not the main muscle layer that you have, but you do have a little bit of a smooth muscle lining there of that mucosa layer. Then just out from that, you have the submucosa. This is where you have more connective type tissue. It's the dense, irregular type of connective tissue. Maybe you've talked about in 168. But that submucosa layer also has nerves associated with it. It has blood vessels and even the small glands that will be producing and releasing the mucus. So here's a nice little diagram of what we've talked about so far. It has a cross section or a section here of a portion of the GI tract, and it's trying to show you the 4 different layers or tunics. We start with the innermost layer, and this is your mucosa layer. Again, it has a little bit of smooth muscle there. It's got some connective tissue, and then that innermost lining is epithelial tissue. And then next you have the submucosa layer. And here you're going to find, again, connective tissue. It's more dense connective tissue. There's blood vessels and nerves associated with it. And you've got those glands that are producing the mucus that's going to be going out into the lumen of the GI tract, which just means the opening or the space here. Now let's look at the other 2 layers. Muscularis externa, this is your main muscle layer. You've got actually 2 layers here of smooth muscle. This is what's doing the contraction and the relaxation to help move the food through the GI tract. So this is smooth muscle. And then on top of that, on the outside, you have another connective tissue layer. This is sometimes referred to as a serosa membrane. Sometimes it's referred to as an adventitia layer, depending on its location. You may remember these terms, the peritoneum, from 168, probably back in chapter 1, it talks about the serous membranes associated with the body. Well, inside of the abdominal cavity, you have the peritoneum. That's where you find that, and many of the organs inside of the abdominal cavity will be connected with this peritoneum, this serous membrane called the visceral peritoneum. If it's outside the peritoneum, then it would be referred to as an adventitia connective tissue layer. So if it's inside the peritoneum, it's called the visceral peritoneum. It's basically a serous type membrane. It's outside the peritoneum. There are a few parts of the GI tract that are not part of this peritoneum serous membrane. So they still have connective tissue around it, but it's referred to as the adventitia layer. So one more time, let's look at this diagram again. Here you see the 2 layers, 2 smooth muscle layers that are around this basically 3rd tunic or 3rd layer, the muscularis externa layer. Notice that the smooth muscle layers are running kind of opposite of each other. You have one that's running circular and then one that's kind of running lengthwise here. So you do have 2 separate layers of muscle there. And then you have that serous type membrane or adventitia type membrane, which is just connective tissue wrapping all that muscle together. Now, section 2, we'll briefly look at the mouth and pharynx and esophagus a little bit. Just a few terminologies associated with the teeth. We'll look at just briefly some of the terms. These are just some vocabulary words you should be familiar with. So, for example, the crown of a tooth. This is what's above the gum line. This is what you see. And, of course, there's enamel there. That enamel is a hardened form of the mineral hydroxyapatite. That's the same mineral that you find in your bones. This is a slightly different composition. You really have 2 main elements here. You've got calcium and phosphate. This is a slightly different composition than you have in your bones, but it's a similar type mineral. That's your enamel that covers the crown. Anything below the gum line is the root of the tooth. And it's covered by a couple of different things. One, you see it has dentin around it. And so, again, if you look at the diagram, you see this little area here called dentin. That's also hydroxyapatite, but it's only about a 70% proportion of it. So it's not as hard as the enamel. So it's less than the enamel. What the living portion inside of the tooth is, where you're going to find the blood vessels and the nerve inside of the tooth. There's actually a cavity there and a space there, an opening that you find the blood vessels and the nerves associated with it. That's called pulp tissue, a softer tissue. It's not hardened like the dentin or the enamel. It's soft tissue, and that's where you find the living portion of the tooth. That's where you're going to find the blood vessels and nerves. Then you also have a layer called cementum. The cementum is an underlying layer that is covering like the root of the tooth, kind of going all the way around the root structure. And this is also hydroxyapatite, but it's not, again, quite as dense as the dentin or the enamel. Now let's move on to the stomach, section 3. Just a couple of anatomical terms here kind of associated with the stomach. You can see the stomach here in the picture. And you see kind of a location up here known as the gastroesophageal region or the cardiac region. It's referred to as a cardiac region because it's a little higher up, closer to the heart. At the opposite end of the stomach, you see the pyloric region, and this is the end that's going to be connecting to the intestines. So just a few main terms associated with the heart. Cardia, again, refers to the higher up portion. It's not really close to the heart, but it's higher up. And so it's referred to as the cardia region. The fundus is kind of this curvature over here on the side. The body of it, the body of the stomach is the main portion of the stomach. And then you have the pyloric region, again, which is going to be connecting to the small intestines. There's also a curvature associated with it, and because you have a smaller curve here, then this is referred to as a lesser curvature, and then you have a larger arch or curvature on this side of the stomach, and that's referred to as the greater curvature, and that's where you have several membranes or ommenta attached. These membranes or connective tissue are going to suspend and kind of hold the stomach in place. Now, if you take a look at the histology a little bit of the stomach, we've already talked about really the layers, but now we need to look at actually the cytology, I guess, the cells of the stomach. You find that you have several different types of cells producing different secretions going into the stomach. And if you were to look at the surface, if you look at the diagram inside of the stomach lining here, there are pits, openings down into it, and that's where you find a lot of these cells that are producing the secretions going into the stomach. So, for example, you would find something called a mucus cell, mucus neck cell. They're called neck cells because they're kind of in the neck zone of this pit. And so they would be kind of up here closer to the top, but they're mucus cells. They're producing mucus. That mucus is viscous. It's relatively thick. It's alkaline, so that means it's a base. And that's going to help to kind of protect the inner lining of the stomach from the acid layer whenever you're trying to digest the food. By the way, it says protects from the acidic chyme. Once you chew up a portion of food and you swallow it, then it's referred to as a bolus, B-O-L-U-S. Then once that bolus mixes with the acid and the enzymes in your stomach, it's referred to as chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Now, another type of cell that you'll find inside of these pits are parietal cells, and the parietal cells are producing hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is there because it tries to help get rid of some bacteria. It also helps to start the process to break down proteins. You also have another type of cell called a chief cell. These chief cells are secreting an enzyme called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is a precursor enzyme. It's a starting type of enzyme that when it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, it converts into an active form called pepsin. Pepsin is the active form of pepsinogen. The activated pepsin is what is needed to really chemically break down the proteins. And once you break down proteins, you'll start forming the amino acids. Then you also have an endocrine type of cell here that's producing a hormone called gastrin. We'll talk about gastrin in a few minutes because it relates to the release of these secretions. So let's kind of look at the 3 phases of stomach secretion regulation. The question this is trying to address is what's causing stomach secretions to be released. And so number 1 is the first phase. It's called the cephalic phase. Of course, if you remember, cephalic refers to the head. Then you will realize that the cephalic phase is when you think about food, you start smelling food, you start tasting a little bit of food, and then the hypothalamus is then sends signals to the stomach to start the release of the stomach secretions. So if you've ever smelled some food and you started feeling hungry and your mouth started watering, that's really what the cephalic phase is all about. And so that's preparing the stomach for digestion. So it's kind of getting a head start of digestion. It's starting to release these stomach secretions into the stomach to get ready for digestion. It's anticipating that food is coming into the stomach. The second phase is called gastric phase. Gastric refers to the stomach and to the intestines. And so gastric phase is once food is actually in the stomach. Once food is actually in the stomach, there's a little bit of a stretch reflex that takes place. That's called distension. So once food is entered into the stomach, it causes this a little bit of stretch on the stomach or in the stomach and on the smooth muscle that's in the stomach. That creates a reflex action that sends a signal back to the brainstem. That sends a signal back to the stomach in a reflex type action that gets the stomach to release this hormone that we talked about called gastrin. Gastrin as a hormone enters the bloodstream, and its target tissue is actually the stomach itself. But it causes the stomach to start releasing more secretion, so more acid and more enzymes go into the stomach mixture. So this is kind of ramping up the digestion phase here. The third phase, the final phase, is called intestinal phase. That takes place whenever the digested food here, or the chyme, the acidic chyme, actually enters into the first segment of the intestines. And that triggers kind of an inhibition type reaction that sends signals back to the stomach here. Again, it's through enzymes, it's through some hormones, secretin and cholecystokinin. Right? These 2 hormones go into the bloodstream and they trigger a reaction that slows down or inhibits the stomach from secreting the digestive enzymes and secretions. So this is kind of slowing down and stopping the stomach from releasing its secretions. So if you remember, just kind of review, cephalic, that starts the process. You think about food, you smell food, right? You taste a little bit of food, and that triggers the stomach to release secretions. And that's through some of the hormones here, the gastrin hormone that starts up the secretions. Secretions are continued to be released to the gastric phase. That's because food actually gets into the stomach, it stretches it, you have a stretch reflex, and it's a positive feedback type action. You actually get more secretions now because of the gastric phase. And then to stop secretions, to slow it down, this is more of a negative feedback reaction, really. Whenever the chyme actually enters into the intestines, you release a couple of hormones here, secretin, cholecystokinin. These hormones go into the bloodstream where they target the cells of the stomach to stop producing those secretions. And so they slow down the production of the acid and the enzymes.